reviews for World of Warcraft: The Ultimate Visual Guide, Updated and Expanded Edition, published by DK. The original edition came out in 2013, and this expanded edition came out in 2016, and so mostly that expansion has to do with, I believe, Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor. And before I get into the actual review of the book, there's something I have to touch on right at the top. So when I finished reading this book yesterday, I was fully prepared to give this a complete rave review, but then this morning when I was just doing a bit of research about it, I actually found out something that has since really dampened my enthusiasm. Because even though this book says updated and expanded, it should actually say updated, expanded, and contracted, because they have cut material out from the first book, and I couldn't find reference to this cut material in any other reviews or anywhere else online. I'm thinking that maybe I had just got a misprint of the book, but I haven't. There has actually been material cut, and so I'm not sure if people just haven't noticed or don't give a crap, but I wanted to point that out at the top of this review since I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere else. So in terms of page count, the updated edition has 16 extra pages. However, in the 2013 edition, there was a back section of about, I don't know, I guess like 8 pages called Behind the Scenes. It was really just sort of like about things like BlizzCon, the trading card games, the books, just that sort of non-fiction information about the franchise. That section has been completely cut from the 2016 edition, which might seem like a small thing, but I just find such a huge disappointment. You know, when you're calling something an updated and expanded edition, I expect it to include everything from the first edition, because I can now imagine, you know, as someone who's a really hardcore World of Warcraft collector, now you've sort of got to keep 2 of these books on your shelf just so you can have that 8 pages or whatever of behind the scenes material. It's really disappointing that DK has done that. But for the remainder of this review, we're just going to ignore that and just judge this edition of the book as it is, in which case I really, really enjoyed it. Even though I definitely consider myself a fan of the Warcraft franchise, I've never played World of Warcraft or any of the other games, and so my knowledge of World of Warcraft is basically just what has entered pop culture and from what I learned from the movie, which was not much, which I actually think kind of makes me the perfect target audience for this book, because it really feels like World of Warcraft 101. Now, when I say that, I don't mean on how to play the game. This is a lore book. It's completely fictitious information. There's nothing on game mechanics or anything like that. It's really just a book about the world, the characters, the story, stuff like that. And as someone who had extremely limited knowledge about this world, this book was a really fantastic introduction. There have also been 2 other lore books released called the World of Warcraft Chronicles, and those are much more text heavy. I think they only have about like 8 images in each book. They're much more like the sort of textbook and the intermediate to advanced Warcraft lore buff who really wants to know everything. And I had originally tried reading the Volume 1 Chronicle first, but found it very dense and a little bit difficult to follow, and sort of difficult orienting myself in the world and understanding things it was talking about. And that wasn't a fault with the book. It's just that I didn't have the prerequisite knowledge. It was sort of like I was skipping to, you know, World of Warcraft 102 when I hadn't studied 101. So going to this book and now having read this, I really feel like I'm ready and excited to move on to the World of Warcraft Chronicles for a lot more in-depth knowledge, because this book was really helpful for the visuals as well, because it is, like most DK books, highly visual, not as much text, and that was really helpful in, you know, learning what the different characters like, getting a visualization of what different regions look like, all that sort of stuff. There is that sort of DK problem of occasionally having one massive image and then surrounding it by images that are so small it's really hard to get any detail. But on the whole, I really enjoyed the visuals of this book. They're drawing visuals from comics, from promotional art, from actual game graphics. One thing I've complained about with the World of Warcraft art books is that they never really gave me the feeling of Azeroth, of the World of Warcraft, but this book completely satisfied that. I feel like it really gives a fantastic impression of what this world is. But like I was saying, people more well versed in the lore might actually find this book a little lacking on the text side. If you are someone who knows a ton about the fiction of World of Warcraft, you're probably going to know a significant amount of the information presented here, because like I said, it is a lot of just sort of small text box, small facts, really just explaining basic information and then recapping highlights. And the text also does have a sort of repetitiveness that I will touch on in a bit. So people with a high level of knowledge on this sort of stuff probably won't get as much from the book. But I think even if you are someone who is, you know, pretty familiar with World of Warcraft, if you've read some of the novels or comics, or if you've played the game a bunch, there's probably a lot in here that you will know. But I do think there is enough information here that will make it valuable, and even if it's not necessarily valuable in terms of knowledge, I think it will present a great value in entertainment for you. So I think this book's really aimed at people who have sort of like no knowledge to basic knowledge to sort of a mid-level range of knowledge, and then after that, you know, you want to graduate to the World of Warcraft Chronicles. It's been so fantastic in the last couple of years seeing how many different video game franchises are releasing these sort of lore books on their worlds. I actually much prefer this approach to, say, just a typical art book that's just showing concept art from the game. I find these really immersive and interesting, and the thing is, this Ultimate Guide is probably one of the best I've read, and I think that's really saying something, because let's be honest, the Warcraft world is not necessarily the most sophisticated fantasy world, but having said that, this book and the Warcraft Chronicles I mentioned are far outshining other franchises that have much more mature fantasy worlds, other games that have these lore books sort of like The Witcher, Dragon Age, Heroes and Might and Magic, blah blah blah. I found the approach those sort of books tend to take is very dry and boring, almost like they are just trying to do like a real history book like you would read in a class, and I just don't think that's the right approach. What this book and the Chronicles have done really well, done much better than those other books, is that they are imparting the lore to you through story and character. A lot of the other lore books for video games really focus on history, geography, anthropology, theology in a really, like I said, boring, dry, textbooky sort of way. You know, here is the kingdom of such and such. It is the home of blah, blah, blah. It has this many citizens. It's located here. Here's a bit of the history. These guys laid siege and then they took over, and then these guys came and then they took over, and this is the major religious faction. It just goes on, and I just find myself getting so confused by all the places and names and factions, and it's just not very exciting or accessible, the sort of way a boring history teacher might lecture it to you. But anyone who's enjoyed studying history will know that the best way into it is finding characters to connect with, finding a story to follow, and that's what these Warcraft lore books have done really well. Right from the start, it's not bombarding you with facts and information, it just gives you an overview of, like, a quick overview of the races and how things stand, and then it immediately, the first section launches into the story of this world. And I say story instead of history because even though it is a history, it's presented with a storytelling focus, which is very, very smart and keeps you engaged the whole way. Even though a lot of the information repeats itself, it doesn't drag. It helps you understand. It really helps you get this sort of framework for what you're working. So then when you read about these characters later, these places later, you have a context to put them in. And I'm so happy that they've taken that approach and done it really well, despite having a somewhat more juvenile and unsophisticated fantasy world to work with. So yeah, while my overall experience with this book was absolutely fantastic, I do want to just sort of briefly touch on some of the weaknesses that you might be interested in. The first thing is that I've mentioned a couple of times is that the text has this sort of repetitive nature. Now, that can actually be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your approach, depending on how much prerequisite knowledge of the World of Warcraft you have. For example, and I don't want to spoil anything for people who aren't familiar with the story, there is a point at which one character poisons another character's weapon, which is a fact that gets mentioned 5 times across 4 pages, which is pretty excessive. And that's the most extreme example, but there are lots of instances of the same information being repeated and repeated again. Now, for me, as someone who was approaching the fiction of this world as a complete noob, I actually found that helpful because it was reiterating points and hammering them home, and so I was never sure. I never had to keep flipping back to pages to be like, what are they talking about? Who's that? Every spread really has a sort of self-contained feel, and I think that's actually the way this book is probably meant to be used and read. I read it from cover to cover, but I don't think that when I go back to this book, you know, in later years, that won't be the way I read it. It's because I'm not sure necessarily that's the way it's meant to be read. I mean, you can, I did, but it feels more like something that you can just open up, and when you find something that entices you and you want to find out a bit more about that character, you can then, you know, flip through and go to that character's page and read about that, and then, you know, you'll read about a location, and then you can flip back, and there's an index in the book which makes, at the back of the book, which makes this really easy, so you can look up, you know, where certain characters are mentioned, and because it's got that self-contained sort of feel, you can get all the sort of basic information you need on one page. You don't need to have read the pages beforehand. You can go back to those if it interests you, or flip forward. You know, it really lends itself to a more free-flowing reading experience. However, if you are someone who is, you know, who knows a ton about this already, you're probably going to find a lot of that very frustrating. The repetitiveness, you're going to be like, why did I pay for this book that's just repeating the same basic information over and over and over again? And then, of course, because all of the text and text boxes are so short, you're really only getting a very brief overview of each character, and you're always pretty much going to be left wanting to know more. But I guess that encourages you to, you know, read the World of Warcraft Chronicles, read the World of Warcraft wiki, read some of the books, the comics, play the game itself, you know, focus more, find about more characters and events and things like that you want to find out more about. And then the only problem that I actually had with the text, and again, I'll try and avoid spoilers for those who haven't played Warlords of Draenor, but there's an instance of time travel in the story which was not explained at all in the book. They just say that someone goes back in time, and then that's sort of it, and then they're just, it's I can't even really explain it. It's so confusing. It was so confusing understanding what time stream things were in, what, not even time stream, but like time and space stream. It was really confusing, and I thought surely it can't be this convoluted, or maybe, you know, a further expansion is going to clear this up. I was really confused, and I went onto the World of Warcraft wiki, and within about 10 seconds of reading on there, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I see how that works now. But the way that the time and space travel sort of all connects to the main story was just not explained at all in the book. But that was really the only instance where the information wasn't really clear. And so, except for the disappointment of those missing pages from this edition, it's a book that I really, really enjoyed.